It was the spring of 1944, in a quiet airfield on the outskirts of Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing ground. A small convoy rolled in under gray skies. Inside one of the trucks, covered by tarpaulin and guarded by armed men, rested an aircraft unlike anything most of the German engineers had ever seen. The markings on its wings had been hastily painted over, but even from a distance, its sleek lines and razor-sharp wingtips gave it away. A P-51 Mustang. Word spread quickly through the facility. The Allies' most feared long-range escort fighter, the one that had followed the American bombers deep into the Reich and back, was finally in their hands. Inside the hangar, Dr. Kurt Tank, chief engineer of Focke-Wulf, stood alongside Dr. Hans Mothop and several Luftwaffe officers. They had come not as soldiers, but as men of science, desperate to understand what made this foreign machine so lethal. When the tarpaulin was pulled back, an uneasy silence filled the air. The German engineers stared, almost in disbelief. The Mustang's airframe looked deceptively simple, elegant, even, compared to the angular aggression of their Bf-109s and FW-190s. "It looks too clean," one of the engineers muttered. "No wasted shape, no excess metal," replied Tank. "Every line has purpose." They circled the plane slowly, taking notes. The machine had been captured after a forced landing near Aachen. Bullet holes scarred its fuselage, but the structure was largely intact. Its Merlin engine, a license-built Rolls-Royce design, manufactured by Packard in America, was still warm when found. That engine, they knew, was the heart of the beast. As the team examined its propeller blades and radiator intake, Dr. Tank felt something he hadn't in months: awe. The Mustang wasn't just well-built, it was optimized. Every inch of it whispered of refinement, of countless hours in wind tunnels, of lessons Germany had once taught the world, but somehow forgotten in the frenzy of war. When the canopy was lifted, the cockpit told another story: ergonomic, efficient. The controls were labeled with precision. Every dial served a clear function, and unlike most German fighters, there was room to move, to breathe. "This is designed for endurance," Mothop said quietly. "Not just combat, but comfort." Tank nodded. For years, they had built aircraft for short, violent encounters, interceptors meant to strike and retreat. But the Americans had built something else entirely. A fighter that could fly across nations, fight, and still come home. That night, as the engineers began dismantling the engine under lamplight, the realization began to sink in. Germany had lost the sky not because its pilots were less brave, but because the war above had changed, and they hadn't kept up. The Mustang wasn't merely an aircraft, it was an idea of range, reliability, and reach. And for the men of Rechlin, that night marked the beginning of a bitter truth they could no longer ignore. The next morning, the hangar smelled of oil, metal, and anticipation. The captured P-51 now sat stripped of its panels, revealing the mechanical anatomy beneath. Its heart, the Packard-built Merlin V1650, gleamed under the cold lights, every pipe and valve speaking a silent language of engineering precision. Dr. Kurt Tank stood with his clipboard, flanked by Hans Mothop and Oberst Peterson, the Luftwaffe's chief of aircraft evaluation. Around them, teams of technicians took careful measurements, documenting everything from the carburetor design to the coolant system. "So this is what makes it breathe," said one of the mechanics, brushing a hand across the smooth cylinder heads. "Yes," Tank replied softly, "this is what gives it life." What astonished them most was how familiar it all seemed, yet how different. The Merlin shared the same fundamental principles as their Daimler-Benz DB605 engines, but where German designs emphasized brute performance, the Merlin embodied balance. It was lighter, simpler to maintain, and tuned not for peak altitude dominance, but sustained power across long distances. Mothop leaned over the supercharger assembly, eyes narrowing. "Two-stage, two-speed," he whispered. "No wonder it breathes at 30,000 feet like it's at sea level." They had heard rumors that the Americans had perfected altitude performance, but seeing it with their own eyes, the truth was humbling. The Germans had built some of the finest engines in the world, yet they had been obsessed with complexity. Every advancement came with fragility. Too many moving parts, too many hours to repair. The Merlin was different. It wasn't perfect, but it was efficient, designed for war, not just victory. Later that day, Tank requested the technical schematics from earlier tests of the FW-190D Dora and the Tau-152, his own high-altitude projects. He compared them, line by line, to the Mustang's engine data. He felt a quiet sting of recognition. The Allies hadn't just caught up, they had evolved. In one corner, Peterson scribbled figures on a chalkboard. Range over 1,600 kilometers. That's nearly double our best interceptors, he said, turning back to the group. This is why their bombers reach Berlin and still return. The men stood silent. Outside, the distant hum of German engines echoed faintly. Training flights, scrambling to defend skies already lost. It's not the engine alone, Tank murmured. It's the philosophy behind it. That phrase hung in the air. The philosophy. For years, German design had prized performance over practicality, the pursuit of speed, climb rate, and raw combat edge. But the Allies had built a system, not just a machine. Engines mass-produced with consistency, airframes built for maintenance and endurance, a supply chain that delivered replacements faster than they could be destroyed. By nightfall, the engineers had fully disassembled the Merlin. Each part was laid out on long tables, labeled with chalk numbers. Some pieces look almost crude, no polished finesse, no elegant machining. But that was the brilliance. They built this to be made by thousands of hands, Multhup said, not just craftsmen. And in that moment, every man in the hangar understood the real imbalance. It wasn't about who could design the best plane. It was about who could build enough of them to never stop flying. The P-51 was proof of that. A simple truth, made of steel and air, staring back at them under the harsh lights. The next dawn was misty and cold. The airfield, once filled with pride and thunder, now felt eerily quiet. Only a handful of mechanics and officers stood around the captured P-51 Mustang, ready for its test flight. A red sun crept over the horizon as Hauptmann Wilhelm Gallen, a test pilot with the Luftwaffe Redefined program, zipped his flight jacket. He had flown everything from the Bf 109 to the experimental Me 162. But this felt different. It's strange, flying an enemy's bird, he muttered, climbing onto the wing. Not enemy, Tank replied softly from below. A teacher. The Merlin engine growled to life with a deep, confident tone. Not the harsh, mechanical bark of a DB605, but a smooth, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of something alive. The propeller spun into a silver blur, slicing through the morning fog. As Gallen taxied down the runway, every engineer held their breath. When the throttle opened, the P-51 surged forward, not violently, but powerfully, climbing with a grace the Germans weren't used to seeing in American aircraft. Then it lifted. For a moment, everyone on the ground fell silent as the Mustang's silhouette cut across the pale sky. The sound was unlike their own planes, deeper, steadier, purposeful. From the cockpit, Gallen's voice crackled through the radio. It's astonishing. The controls, smooth. She climbs like the Dora, but without the strain. Stable, even at full throttle. He pushed higher, the altimeter spinning past 25,000 feet. The Merlin roared effortlessly. No choking, no drop in power. The radiator system, so often the weak link in German fighters, held steady. I'm leveling at 30,000. Power still constant. Gentle handling, even at this altitude. No wonder they escort bombers to Berlin, he said, his tone shifting from curiosity to quiet disbelief. Below, Tank and Peterson exchanged glances. It wasn't just the performance, it was the stability. The Mustang wasn't built for bursts of glory, it was built for endurance. When Gallen returned and the wheels kissed the runway, everyone gathered around as he pulled off his helmet, face flushed from the cold air. It's the first time I've flown something that feels effortless, he said. We build machines that fight the pilot. They build machines that work with him. He turned to the open hangar, where the FW-190D sat gleaming under the morning light. Our aircraft are warriors, he continued. But there's our soldiers. They don't need to win every duel. They just need to keep coming. Tank said nothing, just looked at the Mustang's wings. Long, elegant, efficient. The laminar flow design was revolutionary. Air gliding smoothly over the surface, minimizing drag, maximizing fuel efficiency. That single design choice gave it range, and range gave it dominance. With external tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. Germany had no answer to that. Every pilot in the Reich's Defense Command felt it. Every bomber crewman in the Allied fleet depended on it. The Mustang had become more than a plane. It was the invisible wall that closed in on the Luftwaffe. And standing there on the tarmac, watching the captured bird idle softly, the German engineers understood something profound. They hadn't just lost a machine, they had lost the future. For days after the flight test, the captured P-51 Mustang sat under armed guard in Hangar 7, not as a trophy, but as a mirror. German engineers, officers, and even intelligence staff came in waves to study it. Each walked away quieter than when they arrived. Stacks of papers began to fill the workbenches. Aerodynamic data, engine readings, fuel efficiency tests, and every figure told the same story. The Mustang wasn't just good, it was optimized, built with a philosophy Germany had lost sight of. At one end of the hangar, Oberst Peterson stood with Kurt Tank, reviewing a performance chart. The numbers were impossible to argue with. "It's not faster than our Dora in a sprint," Peterson said. "No," Tank replied, "but it can stay fast. For hours, that difference, endurance over raw power, was the quiet revolution the Allies had embraced, while Germany poured its genius into specialized, complex aircraft. America mass-produced reliability. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine was the perfect symbol of that. It was British innovation, the Rolls-Royce design, replicated with American precision at scale. Across the hangar, another team examined the fuel system. Twin drop tanks, streamlined under the wings. It wasn't flashy, but it doubled the aircraft's range, turning the once defensive bomber escort missions into deep strikes into the heart of the Reich. "They can escort bombers from London all the way here," one young engineer whispered, almost in disbelief. "And then they can fight," another replied. "And win." Tank didn't respond. He just stared at the engine bay, the perfect marriage of power and simplicity. Every line, every cable, every decision served function. No excess, no weakness. At lunch that day, the hangar felt heavier than usual. The engineers spoke softly, knowing they were witnessing not just defeat, but transformation. Germany had once pioneered the skies. From the Me-160 jet fighter to the V rocket, their brilliance had shaped the future of flight. But brilliance alone could not sustain a war. The Allies had taken innovation and industrialized it. In the following weeks, Luftwaffe High Command received the report from Rechlin. It was thorough, technical, respectful, and brutally honest. The Mustang's balance of range, stability, and combat performance represents a decisive advantage in the current air war. It read, "Its long-range escort capability allows continuous bomber coverage deep within the Reich, rendering our defensive tactics obsolete." For the officers who read it, there was no denial left. The sky was no longer theirs. Even the proud aces of the Luftwaffe, men who once dominated Europe's airspace, began to fall from the sky in increasing numbers. Each P-51 that appeared in formation over Germany wasn't just another fighter. It was the physical embodiment of industrial momentum. Tank later described it best in his private notes. "We were craftsmen in an age that demanded factories, artists when the world needed engineers, and as the war dragged toward its inevitable end, that truth echoed in every fading Luftwaffe sortie. The engineers who once dreamed of conquering the air now understood. They had met the future, and it were the wings of a Mustang." By early 1945, the sound of engines over Germany no longer inspired hope. It brought silence, men looking up, knowing what was coming. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had once been. Fuel shortages, shattered airfields, and dwindling pilots had stripped the Reich of its last defenses, and above it all, the P-51 Mustang ruled the skies. Every day, waves of silver aircraft streaked across the cold blue horizon, their long-range tanks gleaming in the sunlight. They escorted B-17s and B-24s unopposed. What few German fighters still scrambled were often destroyed before they could even climb to altitude. At Rechlin, the engineers continued their work, still testing, still documenting, but the purpose had shifted. They were no longer trying to win, they were trying to understand. In a sense, the captured Mustang had become their quiet teacher, showing them what modern warfare truly meant. Not just technology, but integration. Not just skill, but scale. When the Allied forces eventually reached the airfield, they found fragments of that understanding everywhere. Disassembled wings, meticulous notes, engines half taken apart. One American officer later recalled seeing a small handwritten label on a drawing table. "Efficiency is the ultimate weapon." Perhaps it was written by one of those same German engineers, men who realized too late that their brilliance had been trapped inside an outdated system. As the war ended, those lessons would not be lost. Many of the engineers from Rechlin, including those who studied the P-51, were quietly recruited in the years that followed by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Their knowledge, their precision, their relentless pursuit of improvement, it became part of the post-war aviation race. And in a quiet way, the Mustang's legacy lived within them too, because the P-51 wasn't simply the plane that helped win the war. It was a turning point in how humanity approached the skies. It proved that mastery of the air no longer belonged to the fastest or the bravest, but to the nation that could perfect simplicity. In the decades that followed, as the jet age dawned, the world moved on, but those who had seen the Mustang fly never forgot. For the engineers of the Luftwaffe, the memory lingered not as bitterness, but as awe. They had looked inside their enemy's machine and seen the future. And for one quiet moment, in that cold hangar at Rechlin, they understood that genius alone does not win wars. Unity does, precision does, and endurance, in the sky and in the soul, is what truly defines victory.